A routine flight, a sky of endless blue, the quiet murmur of 180 souls suspended 7 miles above the earth. For the passengers of American Airlines Flight 215, it was just another Tuesday. But what happens when the one man holding all their lives in his hands suddenly slumps over the controls, silent and still? What happens when the co-pilot, in a flash of panic and metal, is also lost? The answer came not from the crew, not from a doctor, but from the quietest corner of the plane, where a 14-year-old boy with nothing but a video game and a dream was about to face an impossible choice. This is the story of that choice, and the day a child had to teach the world the meaning of grace under pressure. The Boeing 737-800, operating as American Airlines Flight 215, sliced through the thick, humid air of Dallas-Fort Worth with practiced ease. On the flight deck, Captain David Evans, a man with silver hair and a map of laugh lines around his eyes from 30 years of flying, performed his post-takeoff checks. To his right, First Officer Michael Chen, younger and sharper, cross-referenced the data on his own display. It was a textbook departure. Flaps up after takeoff checklist. Captain Evans said, his voice a calm baritone that had reassured countless passengers and crew members over the decades. Checklist complete, Captain, Chen confirmed, climbing to flight level 350. Below and behind them in the sprawling cabin, 178 passengers settled in for the 4-hour journey to Seattle. Businessmen like Richard Sterling in 3A, already with his laptop open, scowled at the slow in-flight Wi-Fi. A young couple in row 18 held hands, dreaming of their honeymoon in the Pacific Northwest. And in seat 22B, wedged between the window and his mother, sat Carl Nelson. Carl was 14, but a tall, lanky 14 that made him feel perpetually awkward. He was quiet, with large, observant eyes that seemed to absorb everything. In his hands he clutched not a phone or a tablet, but a well-worn paperback about aerodynamics. For Carl, this flight wasn't just transportation. It was a pilgrimage. He was going to see his father, a senior engineer at Boeing's Everett factory, the very place where giants like the 747 and 777 were born. Their relationship was strained, a casualty of a divorce that had left Carl with his mother, Sarah, in Texas. But the one unbreakable bond they shared was a love for the sky. His father had fueled this passion, sending him books, intricate models, and for his 13th birthday, the most Ad Nelson flight simulator rig he could afford. Carl had spent thousands of hours in his virtual cockpit. He'd flown the 737-800, this exact model, in every conceivable weather condition. He knew the startup sequence by heart, the feel of a crosswind landing the specific whine of the hydraulic pumps. He knew the call-outs, the abbreviations, the emergency procedures. It was his world. "You okay, sweetie?" Sarah Nelson asked, placing a hand on his arm. She was a nurse, a woman trained to read vital signs in the slightest flicker of an eye or the pallor of a cheek. She saw the tension in his shoulders. "Nervous about seeing your dad?" Carl shook his head, not looking away from the wing outside as it flexed slightly. "No. Just listening." "To what?" she asked, hearing only the omnipresent hum of the CFM56 engines. "The engines, the flaps retracting, the landing gear locking into place," he murmured. "Everything has its own sound." Sarah smiled, a mix of pride and a touch of concern. He was so different from other boys his age, so intense, so focused. She just hoped his father would see the wonderful young man he was becoming, not just the quiet kid who preferred a flight manual to a football. Leading the cabin crew was Isabella Rossi, a flight attendant with 15 years of experience. She moved through the aisle with an economy of motion that spoke of thousands of flights. Her smile was genuine but firm, her eyes missing nothing. A seatbelt not quite fastened a passenger, looking unwell, a bag sticking out too far. She was the picture of professionalism, the calm center around which the cabin's ecosystem revolved. She gave a nod to a nervous-looking older woman and a quick, reassuring wink to a child traveling alone. To Isabella, a smooth flight was a work of art, and she was its curator. As the plane reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, the seatbelt sign pinged off. A collective sigh of relaxation rippled through the cabin. Drinks were served, movies started, and the mundane rhythm of air travel took over. Richard Sterling in 3A complained that his gin and tonic was mostly tonic. The honeymooners shared a set of earbuds. Sarah pulled out a medical journal to review for a recertification exam, and in 22B Carl Nelson closed his eyes. He wasn't sleeping. He was flying the plane in his mind, his hands mimicking the minute adjustments on the yoke, his feet tapping imaginary rudder pedals. He could see the instrument panel in perfect detail, the primary flight display, PFD, with its artificial horizon, the navigation display, ND, showing their route, the EIKS screen monitoring the engines. He was co-pilot to Captain Evans, a silent partner in the dance of flight, completely unaware that in a matter of minutes the dance would devolve into a terrifying plunge. Up in the cockpit, Captain Evans stretched his arms. "Well, Mike," he said to his first officer, "looks like a smooth ride all the way to the coast. The weather over the Rockies is clear as a bell." "That's what we like to hear," Chen replied, glancing over. Evans smiled a warm, genuine expression. "You know, my daughter just got into the University of Washington. This trip I'm taking her out to celebrate. She wants to be a marine biologist. Smart kid. Takes after her mother, thank God." "Congratulations, Captain," Chen said sincerely. Captain Evans chuckled, then took a slow, deep breath, turning his gaze back to the endless blue horizon. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the words never came. Instead, a soft, guttural sound escaped his lips. His eyes went wide, not with fear, but with a profound, terrifying surprise. He clutched his chest, his left arm spasming. His silver head, a moment ago, a symbol of command and experience, slumped forward, then sideways, coming to rest against the cockpit window with a soft, sickening thud. The calm of Flight 215 had just been shattered. And only one person, First Officer Michael Chen, knew it. His blood ran cold. He was alone at the controls. For a full 3 seconds, First Officer Michael Chen stared at his captain. The world seemed to shrink to the confines of the cockpit, the steady drone of the engines fading into a distant hum. Denial was the first wave to hit him. He's joking. It's a prank, a test. But the slack jaw, the ghastly pallor of Captain Evans' skin, the unnatural angle of his head against the glass. This was no joke. "Dave." Chen's voice was a reedy whisper. "Captain David." He unbuckled his harness with fumbling fingers and shook Evans' shoulder. There was no response. The captain was dead weight, his body held upright only by his seatbelt. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Chen's training. This wasn't a simulator scenario. The checklist for pilot incapacitation felt like a distant academic concept. This was real. The smell of stale coffee and something else, the acrid scent of fear his own, filled the small space. His training finally kicked in, a lifeline in a sea of adrenaline. Aviate, navigate, communicate. The mantra of every pilot. Aviate. He scanned the instruments. The autopilot was engaged, holding them steady at 35,000 feet. The plane was flying itself. For now. He forced his breathing to slow, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Navigate. The flight plan was programmed. The magenta line on his navigation display stretched obediently toward Seattle. No immediate action was required. Communicate. This was the hard part. He had to tell someone. He had to break the sterile peace of the airwaves and announce his emergency. But first he needed help in the cockpit. He pressed the button to call the lead flight attendant. A discreet chime sounded in the forward galley, where Isabella Rossi was preparing a second round of drinks. She answered with practiced calm. "Yes, Captain. Isabella." Chen's voice was strained tight. "Get up here, now, and be discreet." The word discreet sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. In her 15 years, that word from the flight deck meant one of two things. A VIP passenger was having a meltdown, or there was a serious problem. She set down the carton of orange juice, her face a mask of professional neutrality, and walked the few steps to the cockpit door, knocking a soft, coded pattern. The lock clicked open. When she stepped inside, the scene froze her. First Officer Chen, his face ashen, was trying to hold Captain Evans upright while simultaneously monitoring the controls. The captain himself was gone. His eyes were half open, vacant. A thin line of saliva trickled from the corner of his mouth. "Oh my God!" Isabella breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Don't." Chen snapped, his voice cracking. "Don't panic. He's unresponsive. I think it's a massive heart attack or a stroke. I need you to help me. We have to get him out of the seat." Isabella's training took over where Chen's was faltering. She was the link to the cabin, to the potential help that lay just beyond the door. "Is there a doctor on board? We need to make an announcement." "Yes, but quietly," Chen insisted, his eyes darting between Evans and the instrument panel. "No panic. We can't have panic." Isabella nodded, her mind racing. She backed out of the cockpit, pulling the door almost closed, and picked up the cabin intercom. Her voice, when it came, was a masterpiece of control. There was no alarm, only a slight urgency that most passengers would miss. "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. If there is a medical doctor or a registered nurse on board, would you please make yourself known to a member of the flight crew by pressing your call button." In seat 22C, Sarah Nelson's head snapped up from her journal. The phrase was a trigger, a call to action she'd heard a dozen times in hospitals, but never at 35,000 feet. She fumbled for the button above her head. A light illuminated and a chime sounded. "Mom?" Carl asked, his reverie broken. "What is it?" "They need a nurse, honey. Stay right here," she said, already unbuckling. Within seconds, another flight attendant, a young man named Kevin, was at her side. "You're a nurse, registered nurse. 18 years in emergency and cardiac care." Sarah said, her voice all business. Kevin's eyes widened in relief. "Please come with me. It's up front." The hushed urgency, the destination, being the front of the plane, Sarah knew this was serious. As she followed Kevin up the aisle, she saw the curtain to the forward galley drawn. Isabella met her there, her face grim. "Thank you for coming," Isabella said in a low voice. "The situation is critical. It's one of the pilots." Sarah's blood ran cold. She was ushered into the galley, and Isabella opened the cockpit door just enough for her to slip inside. The sight was even worse than she'd imagined. Chen was now trying to fit an oxygen mask over Captain Evans' face, but the captain's body was limp and uncooperative. "I'm Sarah Nelson, RN," she said, her professional demeanor taking over. "What happened? He just collapsed," Chen said, relieved to have someone else to focus on. "No warning. He was talking 1 second, gone the next." Sarah pushed past him, her fingers going immediately to the captain's carotid artery. The skin was clammy. She felt for a pulse. Once, twice, nothing. "He's in cardiac arrest," she announced, her voice stark. "We need to start CPR. We need to get him on the floor, now." Getting a 200-pound unconscious man out of a cramped pilot's seat is a logistical nightmare. It required Chen to unbuckle completely, and with Isabella's help, they tried to heave and pivot Captain Evans's body. The cockpit of a 737 is not designed for this. It's a space of precise function, not medical emergencies. As they struggled, the plane, still on autopilot, hit a pocket of unstable air. It was minor turbulence, a common occurrence over the Rocky Mountains. But for the passengers, the timing was terrifying. The plane gave a sudden sharp lurch. Drinks sloshed. A few people gasped. In 22B, Carl gripped his armrests, but his eyes weren't closed anymore. They were wide open, staring at the drawn curtain of the forward galley where his mother had disappeared. He could hear raised, muffled voices. He felt the bump, but it felt different to him. Sharper. It wasn't just weather. It felt like a control input, an overcorrection. He didn't know how right he was. In the cockpit, the lurch of the turbulence, combined with their awkward maneuvering of the captain's body, created a small disaster. As they lifted, Evans' limp right arm swung free, his hand striking a bank of switches on the center console. At the same time, his foot dislodged from its resting place, kicked the rudder pedals. A cacophony of alarms suddenly erupted. The master caution light flashed amber. The autopilot, receiving conflicting, nonsensical inputs, disconnected with a loud, jarring cavalry charge sound effect. Whoop, whoop, pull up. Whoop, whoop, pull up. The plane, no longer under automated control, responded to the last errant inputs. The nose pitched up sharply. Then, as Chen grabbed the yoke in a panic, he overcompensated. He pushed forward too hard. The nose dropped violently. Flight 215, which had been a model of stability moments before, was now in a steep, terrifying dive. The bottom fell out of everyone's world. The sensation was not like falling. It was like being thrown. In the cabin, weightlessness took hold for a horrifying instant. Unsecured objects, laptops, plastic cups, magazines, lifted into the air, hovering like malevolent ghosts before crashing down. Shrieks and prayers erupted in a dozen languages. Richard Sterling in 3A, a man who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, felt his stomach leap into his throat as he was pressed hard against his seatbelt. The honeymooners in row 18 clung to each other, their romantic dream turning into a shared nightmare. For Carl Nelson, the experience was visceral and shockingly familiar. The negative G-force, the gut-wrenching lurch, he'd felt this before, but only in simulations when he deliberately stalled the aircraft. But the sounds were new. The chorus of human terror was a layer his simulator could never replicate. He watched in horror as a flight attendant who had been standing in the aisle was lifted off her feet, her head striking the overhead bin with a sickening crack before she crumpled to the floor. The world tilted at a nauseating angle. Through his window, the serene blue sky was gone, replaced by the brown and green patchwork of the earth, rushing up at them with impossible speed. "We're going down!" someone screamed. "We're all going to die." Inside the cockpit, chaos reigned. The dive had thrown everyone off balance. Isabella was slammed against the cockpit door. The wind knocked out of her. Sarah, trying to shield Captain Evans' body, was thrown forward, her head narrowly missing the edge of the instrument panel. First Officer Michael Chen was fighting for control, but he was fighting blind panic. The stick shaker rattled the yoke violently in his hands, a mechanical warning of an impending aerodynamic stall. Alarms blared from every direction. Bank angle, sink rate, sink rate. Pull up, pull up. His mind was a maelstrom of conflicting procedures. Push to unload the wings, but the ground is there, pull up. But the stall warning. Adrenaline had swamped his rational mind. He yanked back hard on the yoke, a primal instinct to get the nose away from the ground. It was the wrong move. Pulling back while in a high-speed dive, with the stall warning on the verge of blaring again, put immense stress on the airframe. The wings groaned under the load. The plane shuddered violently, not from turbulence, but from the sheer physics of its situation. As Chen pulled back, the severe G-forces pressed everyone into their seats, and in that moment, the second disaster struck. As they tried to move Captain Evans's body one last time, the unconscious pilot was like a dead weight. In the violent maneuver, his heavy head, which had been lolling, was flung sideways with incredible force. It struck Michael Chen directly on the temple. Chen's world went white. A flash of blinding pain, a spray of stars, and then a dull, ringing silence in his ears. His hands went limp on the controls. His head slumped forward, his eyes rolling back. He was still conscious, but barely. He was disoriented, concussed, and completely incapable of flying a commercial airliner. The plane, momentarily leaderless, began to wallow its nose, rising too steeply, threatening a high speed and stall. The wings rocked precariously from side to side. They had recovered from the dive, but were now careening across the sky like a wounded bird. Sarah Nelson, her nursing instincts overriding her own fear, saw Chen get hit. She saw his eyes glaze over. "He's hurt," she yelled to Isabella, who was struggling to her feet. "The co-pilot is hurt." The cockpit door had been flung open in the dive and had jammed. The chaos of the flight deck was now on full display to the first few rows of the cabin. Passengers saw the terrifying tableau. One pilot slumped against the window, the other slumped over the controls alarms, screaming the plane, bucking like a wild horse. Panic threatened to boil over into mass hysteria. Carl Nelson saw it all. He was no longer just a passenger. His mind, honed by thousands of hours of simulated flight, began to process the scene, not with fear, but with a terrifying clarity. He recognized the specific sound of the autopilot disconnect alarm. He recognized the wail of the sink rate warning. He saw the unnatural angle of the wings through the window. He saw the co-pilot dazed and useless. He saw the flight attendant, Isabella, trying to get on the radio, her hands shaking too much to key the microphone properly. He saw his own mother, a nurse, trying to manage 2 medical emergencies in a space the size of a closet while hurtling through the air. And he realized a horrifying truth. No one was flying the plane. His body moved before his mind had fully consented. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "Carl, no, sit down!" Sarah screamed from the front, her voice a thin thread in the cacophony. She saw him stand up and was filled with a new, sharper terror. But Carl didn't listen. He stumbled into the aisle, pushing past the legs of the terrified passenger next to him. He moved forward, his gait unsteady as the plane rocked. He wasn't walking toward the cockpit to be a hero. He was drawn by an irresistible, terrifying pull. The instruments were calling to him. The alarms were speaking a language he understood. He reached the front of the plane, stepping over the injured flight attendant. He stood at the threshold of the cockpit, gripping the door frame to stay upright. His eyes scanned the PFD. Airspeed bleeding off dangerously. Altitude fluctuating wildly. Vertical speed indicator showing a sickening climb, followed by a lurching drop. Isabella looked at him, her face a mess of confusion and fear. "Get back to your seat. Kid now." But Carl's eyes were fixed on the dazed co-pilot. He saw Chen's hands weakly gripping the yoke, making small, nonsensical inputs that were only making things worse. Then Carl spoke. His voice was shockingly calm, cutting through the noise. It was a voice no one on that plane had heard before. "He's stalling," Carl said, his voice clear and steady. "He needs to push the yoke forward to break the stall add thrust, to regain airspeed, and use the rudder to stop the rocking. Not the ailerons, the rudder." Isabella stared at him, dumbfounded. It wasn't the plea of a scared child. It was a diagnosis. For a moment, Isabella Rossi could only stare at the boy. He couldn't be older than 15. He was lanky with the kind of earnest, oversized eyes that should have been filled with tears. Instead, they were filled with an unnerving, laser-like focus as they darted across the instrument panel. "What did you just say?" Isabella demanded, her voice strained. The plane gave another violent shudder, and she had to brace herself against the bulkhead. "The wings," Carl said, pointing a trembling finger toward the PFD. "The angle of attack is too high. He keeps pulling back, but the plane can't climb. It's losing lift. We're going to fall." The words angle of attack and lift were not words a normal teenager used. They were pilot words. Isabella had spent enough time in jump seats to recognize them. She looked from the boy's intense face to the dazed co-pilot. Michael Chen was trying to function, mumbling incoherently, his pupils dilated. He was useless. Worse, he was dangerous. His erratic inputs keeping the plane in a state of perpetual crisis. Richard Sterling from seat 3A had unbuckled his own belt and was craning his neck to see the source of the commotion. "What in God's name is going on? Is that a child in the cockpit?" He boomed, his voice a mixture of fear and indignation. "Somebody get him out of there and fly the damn plane." "Sir, get back in your seat and buckle up," Isabella yelled over her shoulder, her authority returning in a flash. Her attention snapped back to Carl. Desperation was a powerful motivator. The pilots were gone. She was in command, and she was out of options. "How do you know this?" she asked Carl, her voice low and urgent. "Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, he said, and for a second the absurdity of it almost made Isabella laugh. "I have over 4,000 hours on this exact plane, the Zybo Mod 737-800X. I know this panel. I know what the sounds mean." He pointed again. "That flashing red light, the one that says Master Caution, it's because the autopilot is off and the flight directors are out of sync. He needs to stabilize first, then re-engage." His certainty was hypnotic. It was a tiny island of clarity in an ocean of chaos. Isabella looked at her crew. One was injured on the floor. The other was in the back, trying to calm a hysterical cabin. She looked at her passengers, their faces pale with terror. She looked at Sarah Nelson, the nurse who was now staring at her own son with a look of pure shock and terror. "Carl, please," Sarah begged. "Come back here." But Isabella made a choice. It was a choice that defied every rule in the book. A choice that could get her fired and possibly imprisoned. But it was the only choice that felt like it led away from a fiery crater in the Rocky Mountains. "Show me," she said to Carl. Carl didn't hesitate. He squeezed past her into the holy sanctum of the cockpit. The space was incredibly tight. Captain Evans's body was still slumped in the left seat. His mother was trying to check on Chen in the right seat. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. He didn't go for the controls. He knew better. He reached past the dazed co-pilot and pointed to the center console to the throttles. "He needs power," Carl said, his voice shaking slightly now that he was so close. "The auto-throttle is disengaged. Push them forward, gently, to about 85% N1. Isabella looked at Chen. "Mike, can you hear me?" "Push the throttles forward." Chen blinked his eyes, struggling to focus. He looked at the throttles as if he'd never seen them before. His hand moved, but it was clumsy. "Not that fast!" Carl yelped as Chen shoved them forward violently. The engines roared and the plane surged upward again, pitching them all back. "Easy. You have to be smooth." Sarah Nelson, seeing the situation for what it was, made a decision of her own. Her son might be able to talk his way through this, but not with a concussed pilot at the controls. "We have to move him," she said to Isabella. "We need that seat." It was a Herculean task. Together, she and Isabella unbuckled the dazed co-pilot, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, half-dragged, half-lifted him out of the right-hand seat and into the small space behind it. Chen groaned, but was too disoriented to resist. The co-pilot's seat was now empty. A deafening silence seemed to fall in the cockpit, the alarms momentarily forgotten. Everyone looked at the empty seat. Then they looked at Carl. It was an impossible, unthinkable moment. "I can't fly the plane," Carl whispered, the enormity of the situation finally crashing down on him. His confidence evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark fear of a 14-year-old boy. "It's a game. It's not real." "It's real now," Isabella said, her voice hard as steel though her heart was pounding. She grabbed the radio headset that had fallen and thrust it at him. "Put this on. You know the words. You know who to call. Talk to them. Tell them what's happening. Tell them who you are. I will do whatever you tell me to do." Carl looked from the headset to the empty seat, then to his mother. Sarah's face was a conflict of terror and a strange, fierce pride. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "You can do this." He took a shaky breath. He slid into the first officer's seat. It felt right. The yoke was positioned perfectly for his hands. The rudder pedals were where his feet expected them to be. The sea of screens, which would be an incomprehensible blur to anyone else, was as familiar to him as his own bedroom. He pulled the headset over his ears. His hand trembled as he reached for the radio panel. He had to switch frequencies. He knew the one for emergency. 131.5 megahertz. The guard frequency. He keyed the microphone, his thumb pressing the transmit button on the yoke. He opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. He swallowed the sound loud in his own ears. He tried again. "Mayday. Mayday, Mayday," he said, his voice cracking the voice of a boy, not a pilot. This is American Airlines Flight 215. Is anyone listening?" A burst of static. And then a voice. Calm, professional, and utterly shocked. "American 215, this is Denver Center. We read you loud and clear. We lost you on our scope. What is your situation? Who am I speaking to?" Carl took another deep breath, his eyes fixed on the blue and brown circle of the artificial horizon. "My name is Carl Nelson," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm a passenger. I'm 14 years old. Both our pilots are incapacitated. I think I'm flying the airplane." The silence that followed Carl's transmission on the guard frequency was heavier than any turbulence. In the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, ARTCC, a sprawling, dimly lit room filled with glowing screens. A supervisor named Daniel Sullivan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He'd been an air traffic controller for 25 years. He'd handled engine fires, hydraulic failures, bomb threats, and medical diversions. He had never ever heard anything like this. "Say again, American Tufonfakin," Sullivan said into his headset, his voice a deliberate, practiced calm that betrayed none of the shock he felt. He motioned frantically for his superior, already pulling up every piece of data they had on the flight. "The pilots they're unconscious." Carl's young voice crackled back. The co-pilot hit his head. The captain. "My mom is a nurse," she says. His heart stopped. "We're at..." He scanned the PFD. "We're at 29,000 feet. Airspeed is 280 knots, but it's going up and down. I'm trying to keep the wings level." Sullivan's mind raced. This wasn't a prank. The raw fear in the boy's voice was genuine. Flight 215 had indeed dropped off their frequency and flown erratically for several minutes. This was real. A 737 filled with nearly 200 souls was being flown by a child. "Okay, Carl," Sullivan said, his voice taking on the tone of a gentle coach. "My name is Daniel. I'm going to help you. You're doing a great job. The most important thing right now is to keep the airplane flying straight and level. Can you see the artificial horizon on the screen in front of you? The PFD. Yes, I'm trying to keep the little orange line on the big blue and brown line." The use of the correct term, PFD, sent a jolt of hope through Sullivan. This kid knew something. "That's exactly right, Carl. Just focus on that. Small movements. Don't chase the needle. Just guide it." In the cockpit, Isabella stood behind Carl, her hand resting on the back of his seat, a silent, supportive presence. She watched as his knuckles, white from gripping the yoke, relaxed slightly. He was listening to the voice in his ear, his breathing evening out. Sarah had managed to get a pulse back on Captain Evans using the aircraft's defibrillator, but it was weak and thready. She was now tending to the groaning co-pilot Chen, trying to assess his concussion. The cockpit had transformed into a surreal hybrid of an ICU and a flight school. "Okay, Daniel," Carl said, his voice steadier. It's leveling out a little." "Excellent, son. Now let's talk about the autopilot," Sullivan said. "It's the best pilot in the world, and we want to let it do the work. Do you see a button on the panel in front of you labeled AP Engage or CMD? "I see two of them, CMD-A and CMD-B," Carl replied instantly. "Perfect. Now before you press it, I need you to make sure the plane is perfectly stable. No turning, no climbing, no descending, just for a second. Can you do that?" "I'll try," Carl whispered. He focused all his energy on the PFD, his inputs on the yoke becoming finer, more precise. The simulated hours were paying off. His muscle memory, though virtual, was real. He held the plane steady for 5 agonizing seconds. "Okay, it's stable now." "Okay, Carl, go ahead and press one of those CMD buttons." Carl reached out a trembling finger and pressed CMD-A. A soft chime echoed through the cockpit. The violent rocking ceased. The nose settled. On the PFD, the green letters CMD lit up. The autopilot was engaged. The plane was flying itself again, locked onto a heading and altitude. A collective sigh of relief in the cockpit was so profound it was almost a sound. Carl let go of the yoke as if it were red-hot, his whole body trembling with post-adrenaline shakes. Isabella squeezed his shoulder hard. "You did it, kid. You did it." In the cabin, the effect was immediate. The terrifying lurching stopped, replaced by the familiar steady drone of flight. The panicked screams subsided into whimpers and quiet prayers. Passengers looked at each other confused, but grateful for the reprieve. Richard Sterling, who had been bracing for impact, slowly sat back in his seat, his face pale and slick with sweat. He stared toward the cockpit, his arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by stunned disbelief. But they weren't safe yet. They were a stable airplane with no one qualified to land it. "Great work, Carl." Sullivan's voice came through the headset, a calming balm. "You just saved your airplane. Now we're going to get you on the ground. We are diverting you to the nearest suitable airport. That will be Grand Junction Regional in Colorado. It has a long runway, and we're clearing everything out of the sky for you. We're also getting an expert on the line to help us. A 737 Czech pilot." While Sullivan coordinated the emergency response on the ground, alerting emergency services clearing airspace, rerouting dozens of other flights, a call was patched through to a man named Ben Carter, a veteran American Airlines training captain who happened to be in the Denver Operations Center. When he was told the situation, he flatly refused to believe it. Then he heard the recording of Carl's voice. Within minutes, Carter was plugged into the call, his own voice gruff and authoritative, but reassuring, joining Sullivan's. "All right, Carl, Captain Ben Carter here," he said. "I teach people to fly this airplane for a living. I hear you've been doing one hell of a job so far." "I'm just using the simulator," Carl mumbled, overwhelmed. "Well, the simulator just became the real deal," Carter said. "Daniel is going to handle your navigation. I'm going to teach you how to land. First things first. Let's talk about your fuel." The conversation that followed was one of the most surreal in the history of aviation. A seasoned training captain and a calm-as-ice controller began a step-by-step tutorial. Their voices piped directly into the ears of a 14-year-old boy. They had him check the fuel load, calculate their landing weight, and discuss the appropriate level of flaps and landing speed. Carl, guided by Isabella, who pointed to the switches he couldn't immediately find, worked the controls. His fear was being replaced by intense concentration. He was no longer a scared kid. He was a student in the most high-stakes exam of all time. "Okay, Carl," Carter said after 10 minutes of checks. "The autopilot can fly the approach, but it will be an auto-land. It's a complex procedure. I think it's better if you fly the final part yourself. You'll have a better feel for it. We'll guide you every single step of the way. Do you understand?" "Fly it himself." The words hung in the air. The autopilot was a safety net. Flying it by hand was final. Carl looked out the window. The mountains of Colorado sprawled below them, beautiful and deadly. He thought of his dad waiting in Seattle, oblivious. He thought of his mum right behind him, her life and everyone else's in his hands. He keyed the mic. "I understand. Let's do it." The descent into Grand Junction was the quietest, most tense period of the flight. In the cabin, Isabella had taken the intercom. Her voice was strained but steady, performing a masterclass in crisis communication. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing through the silent cabin. "As you are aware, we have experienced a medical emergency on the flight deck involving both of our pilots. We have a registered nurse on board who is attending to them." She paused, taking a deep breath. "The flight is currently under the control of the autopilot, and we are in constant contact with air traffic control. We are being guided by a team of experts on the ground, A fellow passenger with extensive flight simulator experience is assisting us in the cockpit. She chose her words carefully. Assisting us. It sounded better than a 14-year-old is flying the plane. She didn't mention Carl by name, but everyone who had seen him walk to the front knew. The looks of terror were now mingled with something else, a fragile, desperate hope. "We will be making an emergency landing in Grand Junction, Colorado," she concluded. "Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Brace for landing." The mood shifted. The hysteria was gone, replaced by a somber, prayerful silence. People held hands with strangers. Richard Sterling, the arrogant businessman, bowed his head, his face ashen. He wasn't thinking about his missed meeting anymore. He was thinking about his children. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was electric with focus. Daniel Sullivan, the controller, was a calming presence, vectoring them onto the final approach course for runway 11. Ben Carter, the check pilot, was the instructor, his voice sharp and precise. "Okay, Carl," Carter said. "Grand Junction is at 12 o'clock, 20 miles. Time to start slowing down. We need to be at 210 knots when we intercept the localizer. I want you to use the speed intervention knob on the MCP. Do you see it?" "The mode control panel, yes," Carl confirmed. He reached out and turned the dial. The auto-throttle responded, reducing engine power. The plane began to slow. "Good. Now we need flaps. Let's start with flaps 1. Flaps 1. Carl repeated, his hand moving to the flap lever. He looked at it. In his simulator, he just clicked a mouse. This was a heavy, slotted lever. He gripped it and moved it to the first notch. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the leading-edge slats and trailing-edge flaps extended, increasing both lift and drag. A new, lower-pitched aerodynamic hum filled the air. The process was a slow, methodical ballet of speed reduction and configuration changes. American 215, turn left heading 080, you are cleared for the ILS runway 11 approach, Sullivan instructed. Left to 080, cleared for the approach. Carl repeated, his voice now sounding more like a pilot's than a boy's. He turned the heading knob. The plane banked smoothly to the left, lining up with the invisible electronic beam that would guide them down to the runway. "Okay, Carl," Carter cut in. "We're 10 miles out. Time for gear down." This was a major step. Carl reached for the landing gear lever. It had a lock on it he had to pull first. He lifted it and pushed it down. There was a loud clunk, followed by the roar of the wind as 3 sets of wheels descended into the slipstream. 3 green lights illuminated on the panel. "Gear down, 3 green." Carl reported, his heart hammering. "Flaps 15. Good boy. Now this is where it gets tough," Carter said, his voice softening slightly. "In about 5 miles at about 2,000 feet above the ground, I want you to disconnect the autopilot. You're going to fly the rest of it by hand." Carl's throat went dry. "I'll be with you the whole way," Carter promised. "I'll be your eyes. Just listen to my voice. Look at the PFD. See those 2 magenta diamonds, 1 vertical, 1 horizontal. That's the instrument landing system. Your job is to keep them centered. That's all. Keep them centered and watch your speed. Aim for 145 knots on touchdown." 145 knots. Carl repeated the number, searing into his brain. "American 215, 5 miles from touchdown." Sullivan's voice cut in. "The runway is clear. Emergency services are standing by. You are cleared to land." Cleared to land. "Runway 11, Carl acknowledged. He looked at Isabella, his eyes wide with fear. She gave him a firm, determined nod. His mother, Sarah, peered over the seat, her face a mask of love and terror. "Okay, Carl," Carter said gently. "It's time. Disconnect the autopilot." Carl took a deep breath and pressed the CMD button again. The green light went out. The soft chime sounded, and for the first time the full weight of the Boeing 737 was in his hands. It felt heavy, alive. It wanted to drift. "Eyes on the diamonds, Carl." Carter said, his voice urgent but calm. "You're a little high. Pitch the nose down. Gently. That's it. A little left rudder. Stop the drift." Carl's hands were sweating, but his movements were becoming more fluid. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was feeling. He was flying. The hours on the simulator had built a foundation, and the coaching from Carter was building the house. 1,000 feet, a computerized voice announced in the cockpit. "Looking good, son. Watch your speed. It's creeping up. Pull the power back just a touch." Through the front window, the runway lights of Grand Junction Regional Airport grew from a distant smudge into a clear, beautiful line. It looked so small. 500 feet, the voice called. The plane drifted right. "Left, Carl. A little left, aileron," Carter commanded. Carl corrected. The plane swung back. "Don't overcorrect small inputs. You're doing great." In the cabin, it was dead silent. Every passenger was pushed forward against their belts, their eyes squeezed shut, bracing. 100, 50, 40, 30. The automated voice counted down the final precious feet. "Okay, Carl," Carter said, his voice quickening. "At 20 feet, I want you to look to the end of the runway and start to flare. Just pull back on the yoke gently. Raise the nose just a bit to cushion the landing." 20, the voice said. Carl lifted his gaze from the instruments to the runway itself. It was rushing up at them. He pulled back on the yoke. The landing was not graceful. It was not a greaser. They hit hard. The right main gear touched down first with a jarring bang that shook the entire airframe, followed a half-second later by the left gear with another bone-rattling crash. A tire blew with a sound like a cannon shot. The nose wheel slammed onto the pavement with a shudder that sent a shock wave through the cabin. But they were down. They were on solid ground. "Reverse thrusters now!" Carter yelled. Carl, his hands shaking violently, grabbed the two levers on the back of the throttles and pulled. The engines roared to a deafening crescendo as the reversers deployed, pushing air forward to slow the massive jet. He pressed down on the tops of the rudder pedals, applying the brakes. The plane screeched and swerved, but it was slowing. Faster and faster they went down the long strip of asphalt. The end of the runway was approaching. Finally, with a last groaning shudder, the 200,000-pound machine slowed to a stop well short of the end. For 3 full seconds, the only sound was the whine of the engines spooling down and the frantic beeping of a few remaining alarms. Then Carl keyed the microphone one last time, his voice a choked sob. We're on the ground." From the control tower, Daniel Sullivan slumped in his chair, head in his hands. Across the airwaves, Ben Carter let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. "Attaboy, Carl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Attaboy." In the cabin, the silence was broken by a single tentative clap, then another, and then the entire plane erupted. Cheers, sobs, applause, and cries of relief washed over the cabin in a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated joy. They were alive. They were safe. And their savior was a 14-year-old boy. The moment the plane came to a stop, the outside world invaded. A swarm of fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars, their lights flashing silently against the cockpit windows, surrounded the 737 like concerned parents. The main cabin door was opened, and paramedics rushed up the stairs. Their first priority was the flight deck. They found a scene of controlled, exhausted chaos. Captain David Evans, stabilized by Sarah's quick thinking, and the onboard defibrillator, was carefully extricated and rushed to a waiting ambulance. His survival was a miracle in itself. First Officer Michael Chen, groggy and nursing a severe concussion, was helped down, next confused but alive. Then the paramedics saw Carl. He was still in the right-hand seat, his hands resting limply in his lap. The headset was off. Tears streamed silently down his face, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming release of tension. His mother Sarah was kneeling beside him, her arms wrapped around him, murmuring words of love and pride. Isabella Rossi stood behind them, her hand on his shoulder, her own face streaked with tears. As the passengers deplaned, they filed past the open cockpit door. One by one, they stopped. They looked in at the boy who had saved them. They saw not a mythical hero, but a child looking small and vulnerable in the oversized pilot's seat. A woman with her young daughter stopped and simply said, "Thank you." Her voice choked with emotion. A burly construction worker gave a solemn nod of deep respect. The honeymooners, hand in hand, just stared in awe. Then came Richard Sterling. The impeccably dressed, arrogant businessman was disheveled. His tie was askew, his face pale. He paused at the door, his eyes locking with Carl's. He opened his mouth perhaps to apologize for his earlier outburst, perhaps to offer praise. But no words came. Instead, he simply raised his hand and gave a slow, deliberate salute. It was a gesture of ultimate respect, a concession from a world of power and influence to a world of quiet, unassuming courage. The aftermath was a media firestorm. The story of the miracle over the Rockies was global news within hours. Carl Nelson became an overnight sensation, the simulator savant, the child pilot. But his family, shielded by the airline, and his father, who had flown from Seattle on the first available flight, protected him from the glare. The reunion between Carl and his father wasn't filled with dramatic speeches. When Mark Nelson, the Boeing engineer, saw his son, he just hugged him tightly, a long, silent embrace that said more than words ever could. He looked at his son, not as the quiet, awkward boy he sometimes struggled to connect with, but as a young man of incredible substance and calm. The gulf between them had vanished, replaced by a bridge built at 35,000 feet. Captain Evans made a full recovery, undergoing triple bypass surgery. His first call was to Sarah Nelson, to thank her for the precious minutes her CPR had given him. His second was to Carl. He simply told the boy, "You have the right stuff, kid. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." American Airlines offered Carl a full scholarship to any aviation university in the country and a guaranteed spot in their cadet program when he was old enough. Boeing invited him for a private tour of the Everett factory, where he walked the floor with his father, looking up at the massive jets, not as a tourist, but as a peer. Carl Nelson didn't let the fame change him. He went back to school. He went back to his flight simulator, though now it felt different, imbued with a new weight and respect. He was still quiet, still observant, but something inside him had settled. The awkwardness was replaced by a quiet confidence. He had been tested in a way few people ever are, and had not been found wanting. His story became a modern legend, a testament to the idea that heroes are not defined by age or experience, but by their actions in a moment of crisis. It was a reminder that the passions we cultivate in private, the hours we pour into our dreams, are never wasted. Sometimes, in the most unexpected of moments, that passion can be the one thing that saves not just our own life, but the lives of everyone around us. The boy from seat 22B had not just landed a plane. He had taught hundreds of people and the millions who heard his story that courage can be found in the most unlikely of cockpits. The story of Flight 215 is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they're a quiet 14-year-old boy in a middle seat. Carl Nelson's courage wasn't born in a moment of crisis. It was forged over thousands of hours of dedication to a passion others might have dismissed as a simple game. It shows us that the skills we build and the knowledge we pursue can have an impact far beyond our imagination. In a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, this incredible true story proves that calm competence and bravery can rise to meet any challenge, no matter how terrifying. If this story of unlikely heroism and grace under pressure moved you, please give this video a like and share it with others who need to hear a story of hope. And for more incredible true stories that inspire and astonish, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. What do you think you would have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.